So I was going through it, and I guess I want to start with just maybe having you sort of summarize your ideas and also talk about etudes and how you came to pick this topic and write and curate
Hmm.
this essay for them.
Sure. That one's easy because that actually came to me, right, rather than the other way around. And here's exactly how that happened. So Dr. Higgins, Jean Marie Higgins, is friends and colleagues with the regular editors at Etudes. And I might be misspeaking, but if there's sort of a board of advisors at Etudes, Jean Marie would be part of that group of people. And their regular editors came to Jean Marie and asked her if she would guest edit a special edition on domestic space, which I know is a topic that Jean Marie has a lot of interest in. So I would imagine they knew that. So they asked Jean Marie if she would guest edit a special issue on domestic space, and Jean Marie asked me if I was interested in joining her as a co-editor. Which of course I was, because I say yes to everything that comes my way. But I was also really excited to be asked because I feel like, my feeling about academic writing in general is that not enough designers participate in that. And I think that's a combination of not enough designers being interested in it. And also, I think not enough designers are asked to do it. And this is an issue on domestic space, right? And I thought, who knows more about the ins and outs of what it means to portray domestic space on stage than set designers? Because, I mean, not every set is a domestic space, but many of them are. And by definition, as set designer, we're responsible for putting domestic space on stage. So I seized it as an opportunity to try to get set designers in on that conversation. Um, so that was the impetus for the photo essay, because I figured the best way to get designers involved was to A, feature photos of their work, and B, come up with a format that doesn't require them to actually write a lot, right? So as you saw, those essays that we put together are really short. They're like 250 words at the outside. So anyway, that's how I ended up being involved. The photo essay was an idea that Jean Marie and I kicked around back and forth between the two of us, and the idea was to create something that would be attractive for designers to want to participate in.
Right. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because I actually saw this. I first saw the essay because David Barber shared it on Facebook.
Uh-huh.
And he and I are Facebook friends from our CATF days.
Yep.
And I was like, oh, this is cool. I'm going to read this. And then I saw that you were the one that had curated it. And I was like, amazing. Well,
It's a very, you've heard it before, and I know you already know, it's a very small business.
so small. It's really funny how that stuff works.
When
But
for what it's worth, when I put that essay together, I didn't necessarily format it this way when I presented it, but what we call it the prompt, right? What I asked of the set designers was to send me uh, two designs, per person, and I wanted them to send one design which they thought of as an expected version of domestic space on stage, and I asked for a second design which they would think of as an unexpected version of domestic space on stage. This was a way for me to make sure that I didn't get dozens and dozens of box sets. Because I think domestic space casts a really broad net. So the first prompt was to get something that they thought was very expected, and then something else that they themselves thought was very unexpected, which really helped with the variety, I think.
yeah, that is that is interesting. I think this essay awakened to me exactly how broad this is, and was
Mm-hmm.
certainly like further reaching than I anticipated or had previously considered it being.
Yeah,
I was
that's
kind of
good.
on to like I highlighted some certain spots here. I highlighted the sentence, perhaps domestic space means something different for stamp designers than it does for other theater artists. I guess I would say, like, what do you think you mean by that? And
Mm-hmm.
I guess what would be your theory on what the different meaning would be for different designers?
I think that for what I think what I was thinking when I wrote that is that one thing that I'm always trying to drill down on is I'm constantly trying to remind people that when it comes to making theater, this doesn't make sense, tell me, and I'll try to explain it a little better. When it comes to making theater, the set designer in particular has this really weird thing where we have to do, where we take all of the theory and the themes and the text analysis and the research, all these very abstract notions, and then ultimately we have to materialize those ideas, which is to say that we literally have to put physical objects onto the stage. And I think that that's a unique skill in the theater. Now, we all do things that are physical, right? But the actor works within their own body. Costume designers certainly materialize something, but again, that's always very close to the body. Directors bring things to life, but directors, it's interesting, right? Directors don't actually ever have to make anything, in a sense. They craft performances, they work with designers, they collaborate with everybody, but at the end of the day, they never make a physical anything that they have to hand over to other people. And set designers, I feel like our whole life is about making actual objects, whether it's the drafting or a sketch or a model or the finished product. So that's the part of set design and domestic space that really interests me. I feel like we're in a unique group because we have to materialize it on stage.
Yeah, okay, that does make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, you're putting tangible objects in the space, whereas someone like a lighting designer is illuminating those tangible objects, but they're not the ones that have to decide what objects go where.
Right. And
Yeah.
it's not a value judgment in any way in terms of what's more important than something else. I think everything that we do is important. And you know how I feel about collaboration. I think that it really takes everybody to realize a production. I was just trying to get specific about this just very weird moment that happens in the set designer's process where we take very abstract ideas and turn them into physical objects. There's something about the gateway between those two things that fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's not a difference of like value, it's of like process and like
Mm-hmm.
actual things that you do.
Yeah.
I was drawn to like what you were saying too about your own thing, like with all the travel you do, you bring a few items from home to
Mm-hmm.
establish your own personal like domestic space. Do you think like as designers, our ideas of domestic space that get incorporated into shows also come a little bit from ourselves in addition to like script analysis?
For sure. I
Yeah.
am forever referencing domestic spaces of my own in my own designs. I'm forever referencing the house I grew up in, or my grandparents' house, or places I went on vacation. I'm always referencing my own experiences. It's inevitable, I think. To the point where sometimes, almost like little totems, I will sometimes bring objects from home and put them on a set to I don't know why. It's not a practical consideration. It's some sort of like weird conjuring of something. You know, if I do a play that's set in the 40s, I'm forever putting old photographs of my grandparents on the set. Yeah, I think that's inevitable. I think we're always referencing something of ourselves.
Yeah, well, I thought that was interesting. So I was thinking about like my own personal ideas of what like domestic space would be, and I'm like, well, I'm drawing a lot from my own experiences because your own house or houses of family members that you were close with would be, or just houses and scenes of domesticity you spend a lot of time in would be kind of like your main. That's like the first thing comes to mind because it's like
Hmm.
your source. That's your most direct source you could possibly draw from.
Yeah.
But then I was thinking, well, then every designer would have a slightly different idea about what that would be.
Hmm.
It's like, how do you, I guess you have to strike a balance between like figuring out what like the character's vision of this versus your own vision of it is. I guess like what would you say is like a method for trying to strike that balance?
Oh, well, I think you always work from the character first. And then I think what for me where the overlap comes are, you know, I look for the places where myself or my own life overlaps with the character. So it's like a Venn diagram, you know, if you can find those places where there is an overlap, then you have an opportunity to reference something that you know. If you can't find that overlap, I'm not sure that you actively make a reference,
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And then there's something just like, there's something epically universal about domestic space. Um, which, you know, that's a very theoretical sort of take on it, and you can, you know, we could talk about it forever, but to some degree everybody understands domestic space because it's a part of everybody's life, and domestic space in every regard is and I think this gets referenced in the essays, it's always a double-edged sword. Domestic space creates a, it creates a protected space from the outside world, right? Which is very important. It's private interior space. And, but that, so it keeps out the outside world to the level that it provides comfort, but it also keeps out the outside world to a level that it creates like real anxiety, right? I
Yeah.
actually think this is the most, given the pandemic, I think this is the most interesting time to be thinking about domestic space in our own lives, because I feel like we all really can relate to that feeling of both being safe at home and feeling trapped at home at the same time. So there's something very universal about that, which I think is super interesting.
That's a good point. I was thinking about like you were saying, even like the objects you bring in from the outside world, they become part of your domestic space, but they're still outside world objects.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah,
I,
right. Like for me, I carry them into places I'm going to domesticate the new space I'm heading into, whether that's the tech table or my hotel room. You know, um, it's a small gesture, obviously, but sometimes little gestures make all the difference in terms of making yourself feel at home.
yeah. Well, I was wondering too, if you think about like those objects, I guess you would use some sort of, so like some character analysis for like what some of those objects would be. Like, what do you think about from a script analysis standpoint when you're thinking about designing a domestic space? Like, what do you look for in a script, I guess?
Well, one of the things I look for is what does the space mean in the bigger sense in the context of the play, right? Does the space mean protection? Does the space mean entrapment? Um, does the space have something significant to say about class or money or education? Um, I like to think about how the space means first, and then work from that as a basis to build upon.
And then you would use having taken script analysis with you and think about like the things we would talk about with specific characters.
Mm-hmm.
I guess a lot of the questions you would ask yourself about a character would kind of inform your decisions about then, like within the meaning of that space, what those objects would be.
Yeah, without a doubt. Like you start to build, I love this part of set design because I do have a love of sort of naturalism or dramatic realism on stage. Uh, I love spending time thinking about the history of the character and the objects that they would accumulate over their lifetime, and how to put that history on stage. And then add the second level, the second layer of really trying to understand how a character would behave in their own space. Do they make the bed? Do they, have a jar where they throw change, when they come in the door? Are they the kind of person that has a specific place where the mail goes every time they come up from the street? I really enjoy thinking about all those things. And yeah, you can get at most of that through script analysis, without a doubt.
Yeah. What about like, I was drawn to what you were saying about like the supernatural aspect of this.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a world where you need domesticity, but the world you're in is so vastly different from the real world, like how do you choose which elements of the real world like pass through? 'Cause I think like in terms of movies, like fantasy movies, you can still tell like what the domestic scene is, because despite it being like this fantasy thing, you identify objects that are from the real world.
Yeah.
Like how would you figure out which objects sort of pass through and bridge the gap?
That's a really tough one. I mean, I think it almost comes down to a case-by-case scenario on the individual plays, because, one play is very unlike another play.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly how to answer that in the broadest sense, except maybe to say, again, I would just go back to character and try to figure out what is closest to the character and what is most real for the character. Maybe concentrate on that.
Yeah. Oh, so I want to ask about this too. Yeah. Okay, visit to a small planet.
Yeah.
It's very drawn. I thought that essay was really cool. So, do you consider? I was trying to draw a relationship between your essay and that essay. Do you think it's wise to consider, like, what domesticality or domesticity, however you like to phrase it, like what about like thinking about domestic space in the rest of this small planet?
Well, I think that the domestic space is a planet in and of itself, right? So I think there's a real direct correlation between that essay and domestic space. Particularly, I mean, the easiest way to think of it is a box set, because the box set is so physically contained. I mean, it is almost the mirror of a Cornell box in the sense that it has sort of walls that surround it and make it an object in and of itself. I actually think it's really easy to think of any domestic space as its own planet. It's very useful, I think, in terms of thinking about how to design domestic space.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I was thinking like in terms that like America has a sort of broad, I think this is kind of divided by country in a lot of ways because of just customs. There's kind of a broad sense of like what roughly a domestic scene looks like in America. Thinking if you think about like what that broad scene looks like in the world that the play is in, maybe that also kind of informs your decisions a little bit about like what domestic space looks like.
Yeah, I mean, that's where it bridges the gap between research, right? Just sort of assembling objects based on research to mimic reality and becoming something that's theatrical, right? Even the most realistic box set is inherently theatrical. I mean, the thing that I drill down on in my own introduction, which I think is always really important to remember, is that even when we're talking realism or naturalism, we're really only representing something. I mean, there is no such thing as real on stage. So everything is theatrical in that sense. Realism is highly theatrical in that sense, which I think that to me is super fascinating. And I think it's going to be my next essay, sort of a defense of realism in set design, where the point of that essay is to sort of go back over and over again and say, there's nothing real about this. That's what's so fascinating about it. If you walk behind the most realistic set in the world, there won't be anything upstage of it, right? It'll just be naked flats on the backside. Anyway, that's sort of what fascinates me. There's an inherent theatricality to everything that we do on stage.
That's what I loved about David Barber's set for Support Group for Men at CHS last year, which was the Chicago apartment.
Yeah.
Because the apartment itself was so realistic. And then the lighting design of it too was very hyper-realistic design. And when you like stood at the front of the stage and looked upstage at the set, you would think you are in an actual apartment if you didn't know there was like 600 seats behind you.
Yep.
But the second you like stepped a little bit farther upstage, like pretty much all the space the actors were in the entire time, you could easily tell from there that it was not a real apartment. Because like if you stood in the little kitchen area, like the counter, the bar counter that you can see from the front looks awesome, but on the backside it was like just exposed wood basically. And actually there was a little shelf there that was holding a strobe light so we could strobe the kitchen at one point.
Yep.
There's a lot of spots the actors could stand where you could tell like it wasn't a real apartment, but it was so convincing from the front.
Yeah. That's what this term simulacra or simulacrum means. That's in at least my essay or some of the other essays. It's about reminding everybody all the time that this is just a simulation of reality. And there's something that just fascinates me over and over and over again. I mean, for me, I'm convinced that I'm in the theater because I was exposed to backstage at a very early age. Maybe even before I even saw it from the front, I saw it from backstage. So I've always sort of understood it as artifice. Even when the artifice is meant to be hyper real as is humanly possible to achieve on the stage, it's still made out of artifice. And it's a little bit like being a magician. And that never gets tired.
Yeah.
And I think that when you talk about domestic space, because there are so many domestic spaces in the canon of plays that are written to be box sets, that's when the magic is sort of the most strong. Like if you can really get people, if you can seduce people into believing it is real, when you know how artificial it is, that's pretty amazing.
Right.
That is pretty amazing. And then for me, there's a layer of domestic space in the theater that I haven't even tapped into yet, but I would like to in the future, which, I mean, I begin to allude to it, I think, when I talk about the green room or the tech table in my introduction. But I think that theater in general is kind of a domestic space. I think that every green room is a domestic space. I think that every dressing room is a domestic space. I think that every electrics closet is a domestic space. I think that every sort of staff of IATSE stagehands that's been working together for 25 years is a domestic space. I think that in theater, I think you could look at domestic space forever. It's like a hall of mirrors that kind of never stops.
Yeah. Just for like my purposes, would you just like define domestic space very clearly to like just, channel my thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think that domestic space it's both narrow and broad at the same time. And I think the best way to think about it is domestic space is any space that you create that is meant to keep the harsh realities of the real world at a distance. So whether that's your bedroom, that's certainly a domestic space because it's private and it's interior and it's meant to separate you from the realities of the world. Your living room does that. Your house does that. The green room does that. I think there are a lot of spaces that do that. Places where you can be private.
and places you have control over, because towards the end of the essay you talk about like um the sort of the anxiety we get from the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it comes from a lack of control.
Yeah. And I think that yes, I think that all of that is true. I think that the control that we feel in our domestic spaces is largely artificial. And I think that's one of the reasons why domestic spaces create an innate anxiety in all of us. We work very, very hard to create them so that we feel like we have control over them and that the outside world will not get in. But we all know that that's impossible, right? Like I
Yeah.
say in the essay, the phone rings, somebody knocks on the door, the pipe bursts. There are a million ways in which the outside world will always intrude upon our domestic spaces, our interior spaces. But we work very, very, very hard to create cocoons for ourselves that make us feel like we're protected from the outside world. But it's a thin facade when all is said and done.
Right. So I guess like even your house is probably, or your place of residence, you've made your home, is probably your like the place you can most easily control. And
Mm-hmm.
because even though like I have a screen here which I can bring, because of the internet, almost any part of the outside world into my room, I still have complete control over that. But if the pipe in my wall does burst, I don't have a choice but to call a plumber, and then
Right.
like you can't control that they come in. That part of the outside world comes in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to, not to sort of like over dramatize it, but I do think we always know that no matter how hard we try to convince ourselves that our private spaces are private and protected, there's a limit to what we can actually do.
Right.
And I think that there's always an anxiety that follows us with that. And also, no matter how much we create a space that we feel protected in, there comes a point where it feels like a prison, and we have to get out.
Right.
No matter how nice. I love this little studio room that I'm in. I love it to pieces. I made it exactly the way that I want it to be. And there are days when I just need to get out of here because it becomes overwhelming to me. So anyway, when I think about designing domestic spaces, I like to think about that duality all the time as well. They have to be comfortable and anxious all at the same time.
Yeah,
Somehow.
because there's balance to everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have an example, like offhand, of a show that you designed that required you to think about these things and like what you did with it a little bit?
Let me think. Well, this is weird, but the show that's been on my mind mostly as I've been thinking about realism in set design has been Death Trap. Do you know Death Trap?
I do not.
It's it's a play from the 70s, and it's essentially an interior. The whole play takes place inside of one interior set. Um, but that's a play where I feel like the naturalism of the design is super important because the play keeps convincing you that one thing is the truth. And then it's a thriller. So it convinces you that one thing is the truth, and then it pulls the rug out from under the audience and makes them understand that they've been watching people act in a certain sense, right? So two people who appear to be going at one another as if they're going to kill one another, their intent all along has really been to kill the wife by forcing her into having a heart attack. So the audience believes what they see. They believe these two men hate one another and they're going to kill one another until the moment that the wife falls over dead and the two guys hug one another because they've done it, right? So, that's a play where I feel like the illusion of reality is super, super important. You can't ever let the audience off the hook in the sense that you don't want to do anything that makes them believe that what they're seeing is not reality. And
Yeah.
that's really hard to accomplish. It's really hard to accomplish. I mean, the one place where the thing that made me think about this actually had to do with a conversation I had with the lighting designer who came over. A lot of this play takes place at night, and there are a lot of windows, right? And there's a lot of talk about it's dark outside, it's black outside, it's night outside, and the lighting designer came over at one point and asked me if I had any comments or anything I wanted to say. And I generally thought it looked great, but it was always blue outside, right? Like you would look out the French doors and it would be blue. I mean, like blue.
Yeah.
And in that sense where, blue equals night because it's not sort of gold or white outside. And my one comment was, I don't understand why it's blue outside when it's night. We never really got anywhere in that conversation because I don't think he understood what I was saying, and that's fine. But when I looked at the set and the light simply was not on outside, it looked like night, right? Because when I'm at home at night and the lights are on inside my house, when I look at the window, I just see black outside. I don't ever see blue. And I felt like it was injecting a theatricality into the proceedings that was ultimately going to keep the audience from being fully seduced into thinking the thing was real.
Right, because nighttime really is if anything an absence of light more than it is a blue sky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in that instance, and again, I would bring it all back to the point to remind us that we're not talking about anything real. We're talking about, does blue signify night or does black signify night better in this particular instance? And I think that in this instance, black signifies night better than blue signifies night.
Because you're going for a more realistic approach to the play.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that the definition of domestic space, especially in the theater, is really hard to pin down. And I think a lot of things satisfy a definition of domestic space. And I think how we make it, how we signify it, can also be radically different across the board. At the end of the day, what I think is fascinating is how many different ways there are to represent domestic space when it comes to how you do it on stage.
Yeah.
So it's elusive, which is what makes it really interesting.
Yeah. No, I think I'll definitely bring that forward to them, because that could be a great place to start from too, and say, so this is like an elusive thing. There's a lot of kind of interpretations as to how you go about doing this. So what are your interpretations, and kind of launch them from there and see where it goes.
Yeah. I think it's going to be cool.
Yeah. I'm excited to see how it turns out. So I think,
Right on.
I don't know when the first roundtable is coming out, but it's a very interesting discussion with people about COVID-19, like what they're doing now and like how they're staying creative and staying sane. It's funny because people had different answers to it. But like one of my friends that came on and talked as a lighting designer with Available Light Incorporated, and he was like, yeah, I mostly do trade shows and conventions and stuff. So he said, so I was on the road about 200 days a year at least. He said, so now it's like so weird being at home all the time. He's like, I think I need a new mattress, because it's like, he's like, this is crazy. I'm like, my apartment. So it wasn't just that he's in Boston at home all the time in their home office there. He was in his apartment all the time.
Right.
So from not even going to work. It was interesting to talk to people about how they're interpreting that now. But
yeah, it's another fascinating topic, I think, because you'll get so many varied answers to that, and they're all legitimate, right? It's just as legitimate to want to be busy right now as it is to sort of want to be still. They're both completely valid responses, but just personal to the person.
Yeah,
it's a weird time. I mean, it's a fascinating time. I mean, I wish we didn't have to go through it. Don't get me wrong, but it's also like really fascinating on a human level, because it's forced so many discussions and reactions to come to the surface. I feel like the more we look at it, the more fascinating it is.
Yeah,
Although I wish I was at work because I like to work.
same. Yeah, I think it said a lot to me about people and in some encouraging and also very discouraging ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think because this is such a monumental time, that will come out the other side of this with a completely different culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that will, I think, drastically change theater, because theater is a lot of our representation of culture, especially like in the types of shows that get written. I think you'll kind of see this effect that, you know, I don't know how long it will take, so I don't want to like put a number of years on it, but some time down the road, we're going to start seeing shows set in a post-pandemic world
Yep.
that are going to look so vastly different from the pre-pandemic world.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess like this time before 2020, I think even 10 years from now will be almost historical to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also interested to see how the ways in which we have to change how we make theater. I'm interested to see what the impact is on what gets written or how we do it. Because that always has an effect, you know, like if we end up in a world where actors can't touch one another, then I mean, what does theater look like when actors can't touch one another? Right? I mean, the plays we always do will always be around, but we're also going to write new plays. So I'm just interested to see what the new plays look like that come out of this situation. So,
Yeah,
and some of it is cultural and some of it is practical, right? So if we have to write plays where actors don't touch one another. What are those plays going to look like? I don't know, but I'm fascinated to find out.
it's going to be very interesting. I've had a lot of conversations with people too about how to now incorporate technology in theater to make it more accessible in this world. Because I'm not sold on reading a play over Zoom. I think
Yeah.
it's cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's relatively innovative. It just, I don't get out of it what I do from in-person theater,
Yep.
which I don't think anyone's expecting you to, but it's not captivating enough for me.
Yeah.
I think also just watching that, it simultaneously makes me sad that I'm not doing real theater. Um, but we were talking about like different ways we can use technology to create art this summer, and the way
Mm-hmm.
I'm just having lots of discussions like this one, to just sort of keep our minds engaged with entertainment. But we're also thinking about like how technology could play in. Like now that we're all out there learning all these like tech skills,
Yep.
like now once we get to go back into theaters, how people bring them in. So we're all learning a lot of new things right now. And we had a friend of mine and I were talking about this idea of like actually encouraging people to bring their phones out and
Mm-hmm.
and using the phones as a prop in the hands of the audience, and then taking actors on stage and doing a silent show, no speaking, just acting, and then clues or revelations of various sorts. I mean, the media you can put on a phone is almost endless. Um, you can use the phones to be a source for adding cues and context to what you're seeing on stage, because there's no lines, but you're
Mm-hmm.
getting prompts through the phones in the audience's hands that inform what's happening on stage.
Yeah. Super interesting. I
Mm-hmm.
wish we could, I actually wish, I mean, I know it would be a rush, but I wish that we could start to, and maybe we will do this because let's face it, I think we've got a lot of time, I think, before we're all back in the theater together.
Yeah.
Um, I wish that people would begin to bring these ideas to virtual theater now. I mean, I agree with you. I don't get much from a Zoom reading. I'm glad that they're there, but I feel like it's not super thoughtful about how we're doing theater to simply just put it in Zoom. But I do think that there's a more provocative, thoughtful way to do that if we started having discussions about how to do it.
Yeah, I think there's a way you can make it more artistic, and maybe that way is using people's phones and putting on a silent thing in Zoom that they're just watching. Or you could even record that as video
Uh huh.
and then people could watch it using their phone prompts anytime.
Right.
Convenience. You don't have to make a scheduled live stream.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think just watching, because we're taking, it's about as what we're seeing on Zoom right now is about as traditional as you could possibly make theater online.
Yep.
And that's that they're taking literally what theater was and putting it on Zoom and maxing out like Zoom's limitations to make it as realistic as possible. I just don't think that that's a realistic take on what this can be.
Yeah.
It cannot be the same thing. So find a way to make it interesting and engaging that that adds excitement to online theater. So you're not just watching somebody read a script.
Mm-hmm. Did you watch that performance? It was literally called In Zoom.
I did not.
I'm going to make a recommendation that you Google that when we get off the phone. It's only 10 minutes long, and it's not, it's not the second coming or anything, but I feel like it was the first time where the two actors who do that piece were, I mean, people have referenced Zoom, right? Like that thing that Penn State did where it was like, we're rehearsing a play on Zoom. That was the play. This is also very self-conscious about being in Zoom, but it uses the limitations of what this is in really surprising and theatrical ways. And for what it's worth, it's the only thing that I've watched on Zoom that actually moved me. I was so surprised that there was a point where I was like choked up, because that's not an experience I'm having when I'm watching other Zoom stuff. So, I mean, I think it's worth the 10 minutes to sort of check it out and see what it is. It's pretty cool.
Sounds great. We'll definitely look into that.
Yeah, but we'll see. I mean, I'm really interested too in seeing what theater can be outside of the theater building.
Right.
Whatever that means. I'm really anxious to get to work on that, but it doesn't feel like anybody is totally ready to do that yet. And I mean, I guess I'm talking about like my current collaborators, right? The writers and directors and designers that I work with on a daily basis, the regional theaters where I work, I keep sort of emailing or phone calling, getting on the phone with people and saying, so what should we do? We should do a thing. Let's do a thing. And nobody really seems ready to do that now. I wish they were.
Yeah. Well, and I'm afraid because of the way we're going about reopening, it's going to prolong the time that we're out of the theater because the things that got to open first are going to be the things that profit from the current economic stability we're experiencing, but they're also going to be the things that sort of enact the second wave of COVID that's coming. It's inevitable. And I'm really afraid it's going to hit right about when colleges are actually trying to do the literal reopening. I mean, it's hard to predict when these things will happen, but in some places it's already happening, like Arizona's having a really hard time right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's going to be interesting. And I think this is one thing we were discussing in the first roundtable that I hosted, which was a lot of us weren't really sold on going back and doing this until we can really go back and do this and not sell just half the seats, not produce a show that an audience never sees in person. We only live stream it online. Like none of that.
Yeah.
That's not the same fulfilling experience as producing a show for just a normal audience.
Yeah.
I think kind of knowing that you can't provide access to the show to everybody who wants it will be hard for people. Because like, think about a Penn State show, it's priced to pay for the cost of producing it plus some off the top, which is like how you have to do it. So the thing about Penn State show is pretty much about as accessible as it can be, and if people want to see it, they can come see it. We don't usually have like such a shortage of tickets for them. It's very accessible, especially to students who get a discounted rate. Like if you're in Penn State and you want to go see a show, you can go see a show. That's very doable. And I don't love the idea of producing theater when that's not the case. Because then you also risk, these new waves of how we think about producing this. We also risk making it an exclusive thing.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's totally true.
Yeah.
I hear you. I think I agree. Like I'm not excited to go back and try to do a ghost of what we used to do, you know, or a unfulfilling version of what we used to do because there's nobody in the audience or seats are 8 feet apart. I feel the same way. I just think that I just hope that everybody feels inspired to do something else in the meantime rather than just wait it out.
Right.
Because I want to see new things happen. I mean, there is a little bit of an opportunity in all of this for new things to emerge, which doesn't necessarily have to kill the old thing dead in its tracks, you know?
Yeah.
But it might be more interesting in the meantime than just sort of waiting for the old thing to come back again.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's true. But before we leave, that's one thing I'm trying to ask people. Do you have right now one book that you think is important to be reading right now? At least
Oh
one.
gosh, sure. Let me just, as I look around at all these books, let me just think about the one that I think is really important right now. Uh, okay, I'm going to tell you what I think is really important, but the why is what's important to me. Um, I literally yesterday I reread Peter Brook's The Empty Space. The reason I chose to read this book is because here's what I feel like I see on social media from everybody in the theater world. In this time of COVID-19, I'm rereading The Empty Space because I'm sure that when we come back from all of this, we need to go back to the basics of theater, which is just a lone actor on an empty stage speaking to an audience. And everybody is using this book as their Bible for going back to that way of doing theater. So I decided to revisit this book, and I assure you that at no point in this book does Peter Brook speak in a way that is anti-spectacle. In fact, this book is filled with discussion about spectacle. So I think that everybody should reread The Empty Space and they should mine it for what is important about spectacle in the theater and why we should be very wary of this idea that theater doesn't need anybody but an actor and an audience.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, at its heart, there is some truth to that, but there's no such thing as an undesigned space in the theater. An empty space is a designed space. Somebody made those choices for specific reasons. So I don't buy it. So I think everybody should read The Empty Space again, and they should think about the value of spectacle, and they should think about how somebody making decisions about spectacle in theater is completely unavoidable.
No, I think
It's
that's
also really short. I read it in 3 hours.
yeah, that's not bad at all.
Yeah, so that's what I've got.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Cool. Well, this was fun.
Yeah.
It's great to catch up. I appreciate your time. So thanks
Yeah,
for doing
my
this.
pleasure. It was nice to talk.
Yeah, great to catch up. So, all right. Well, take care and stay safe.
You too. Catch you later.
See ya.
Bye, Kyle.